Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. So let's get started with the continuation. We were reading Man's Search for Meaning and we were in this line. So to attempt a methodical presentation of the subject is very difficult, as psychology requires a certain scientific detachment. But does a man who makes his observation while he himself is a prisoner possess the necessary detachment? Such detachment is granted to the outsider, but he is too far removed to make any statements of real value. Only the man inside knows. His judgments may never be objective, his evaluations may be out of proportion. This is inevitable. An attempt must be made to avoid any personal bias, and that is the real difficulty of the book of this kind. At times, it will be necessary to have the courage to tell of very intimate experiences I had intended to write this book anonymously using my prison number only. But when the manuscript was completed, I saw that an anonymous publication it would lose half of its value, and that I must have the courage to state my convictions openly. I therefore refrained from deleting any of the passages in spite of an intense dislike of exhibitionism. I shall leave it to others to distill the content of this book into dry theories. This might become a contribution to the psychology of prison life, which was investigated after the First World War and which acquainted us with the syndrome of barbed wire sickness. We are indebted to the Second World War for enriching our knowledge of the psychopathology of the masses. For the war gave us the war of nerves, and it gave us the concentration camp. As the story is about my experiences as an ordinary prisoner, it is important that I mention, not without pride, that I was not employed as a psychiatrist in camp or even as a doctor, except for the last few weeks. A few of my colleagues were lucky enough to be employed in poorly heated first aid posts, applying bandages made of scraps of water waste paper. But I was number 119104, and most of the time I was digging and laying tracks for railway lines. At one time, my job was to dig a tunnel without help for the water main under a road. This feat did not go unrewarded. Just before Christmas 1944, I was presented with a gift of so-called premium coupons. These were issued by the construction firm to which we were practically sold as slaves. The firm paid the camp authorities a fixed price per day per prisoner. The coupons cost of the firm 50 pfennigs each and could be exchanged for 6 cigarettes. Often weeks later, although they sometimes lost their validity, I became the proud owner of a token worth 12 cigarettes. But for more important, the cigarettes could be exchanged for 12 soaps, and 12 soaps were often a very real respite from starvation. The privilege of actually smoking cigarette was reserved for the capo who had his assured quota of weekly coupons, or possibly for a prisoner who worked as a foreman in a warehouse or workshop and received a few cigarettes in exchange for doing dangerous jobs. The only exceptions to this were those who had lost the will to live and wanted to enjoy their last days. Thus, when we saw a comrade smoking his own cigarette, we knew he had given up faith in his strength to carry on, and once lost, the will to live seldom returned. When one examines the vast amount of material which has been amassed as the result of many prisoners' observations and experiences, 3 phases of the inmate's mental reactions to camp life become apparent. The period following this admission, the period when he is well entrenched in camp routine, and the period following his release and liberation. The symptom that characterizes the first phase is shock. Under certain conditions, shock may even precede the prisoner's formal admission to the camp. I shall give as an example the circumstances of my own admission. 1,500 persons had been traveling by train for several days and nights. There were 80 people in each coach. All had to lie on top of their luggage, the few remnants of their personal possessions. The carriages were so full that only the top parts of the windows were free to let in the grey of dawn. Everyone expected the train to head for some monotonous factory in which we would be employed as forced labor. We did not know whether we were ill in Silesia or already in Poland. The engine's whistle had an uncanny sound, like a cry for help sent out in commiseration for the unhappy load which it was destined to lead into perdition. Then the train shunted, obviously nearing our main station. Suddenly, a cry broke from the ranks of the anxious passengers. There is a sign, Auschwitz. Everyone's hearts missed a beat at that moment. Auschwitz. The very name stood for all that was horrible. Gas chambers, crematoriums, massacres. Slowly, almost hesitatingly, the train moved on as if it wanted to spare its passengers the dreadful realization as long as possible. Auschwitz. With the progressive dawn, the outlines of an immense camp became visible. Long stretches of several rows of barbed wire fences, watchtowers, searchlights, and long columns of raked human figures grey in the greyness of lawn, trekking along the straight, desolate roads to what destination we did not know. There were isolated shouts and whistles of command. We did not know their meaning. My imagination led me to see gallows with people dangling on them. I was horrified. But this was just as well because step by step we had to become accustomed to a terrible and immense horror. Eventually, we moved into the station. The initial silence was interrupted by shouted commands. We were to hear those rough, shrill tones from then on. Over and over again in all the camps, the sound was almost like the last cry of a victim, and yet there was a difference. It had a rasping hoarseness as if it came from the throat of a man who had to keep shouting like that, a man who was being murdered again and again. The carriage doors were flung open and a small detachment of prisoners stormed inside. They wore stripped uniforms, their heads were shaved, but they looked well fed. They spoke in every possible European tongue, and all with a certain amount of humor, which sounded grotesque under the circumstances, like a drowning man clutching a straw. My inborn optimism clung to this thought. These prisoners look quite well. They seem to be in good spirits and even laugh. Who knows, I might manage to share their favorable position. In psychiatry, there is a certain condition known as the illusion of reprieve. The condemned man, immediately before his execution, gets the illusion that he might be deprived at the very last minute. We too clung to shreds of hope and believed to the last moment that it would not be so bad. Just the sight of the red cheeks and round faces of those prisoners was a great encouragement. Little did we know then that they formed a specially chosen elite who for years had been the receiving squad for new transports as they rolled into the station day after that. They took charge of the new arrivals and their luggage, including scarce items and smuggled jewelry. Auschwitz must have been a strange spot in this Europe of the last years of the war. There have been unique treasures of gold and silver, platinum and diamonds, not only in the huge storehouse, but also in the hands of the SS. 1,500 captives were cooped up in a shed built to accommodate probably 200 at the most. We were cold and hungry, and there was not enough room for everyone to squat on the bare ground, let alone to lie down. One 5-ounce piece of bread was our only food in 4 days. Yet I heard the senior prisoners in charge of the shed bargain with one member of the receiving party about a tie pin made of platinum and diamonds. Most of the profits would eventually be traded for liquor. I do not remember anymore just how many thousands of marks were needed to purchase the quantity required for a gay evening. But I do know that those long term prisoners needed snaps. Under such conditions, who could blame them for trying to dope themselves? There was another group of prisoners who got liquor supplied in almost unlimited quantities by the SS. These were the men and who knew very well that one day they would be relieved by a new shift of men and that they would have to leave their enforced role of executioner and become victims themselves. Nearly everyone in our transport lived under the illusion that he would be reprieved, that everything would yet be well. We did not realize the meaning behind the scene that was to follow presently. We were told to leave our luggage in the train and to fall into two lines, women on one side, men on the other, in order to file past a senior SS officer. Surprisingly enough, I had the courage to hide my haversack under my coat. My line filled past the officer man by man. I realized that it would be dangerous if the officer spotted my bag. He would at least knock me down. I knew that from previous experiences. Instinctively, I straightened and on approaching the officer so that he would not notice my heavy load. Then I was face to face with him. He was a tall man who looked slim and fit in his spotless uniform. What a contrast to us, who were untidy and grimy of an hour-long journey. He had assumed an attitude of careless ease, supporting this right elbow with his left hand. His right hand was lifted, and with the forefinger of that hand, he pointed very leisurely to the right or to the left. None of us had the slightest idea of the sinister meaning behind that little movements of a man's finger pointing now to the right and now to the left, but far more frequently to the left.